Another Lobby for Cyprus seminar at the Hellenic Centre. We're very fortunate indeed to have two excellent speakers who really need no introduction, but I will make some introductory comments and of course introduce them. The title for today's seminar, the Lobby for Cyprus seminar, is Are Bicommunalism and Bizonalism Redundant Concepts in the multi-ethnic Cyprus of today? Now, you've probably realised that one of our speakers is not yet here. Dr Kyriakides is on his way. He did say he would have to be a little bit late because he is lecturing at his university. But I'm sure that those of you who have heard Klearchos Kyriakides speak will know it's definitely worth waiting for him to arrive. Now, Professor Coufoudakis will speak on the Bizonal Federation model and the destruction of the Republic of Cyprus. Again, we are very privileged and honoured that Professor Coufoudakis is here with us. Professor Coufoudakis is Rector Emeritus at the University of Nicosia, Dean Emeritus of the College of Arts and Sciences at Indiana University, Purdue University at Fort Wayne, and Professor Emeritus of Political Science as well. He is author and editor of numerous books and has written more than 95 journals, articles and book chapters published worldwide. His books include International Aggression and Violation of Human Rights, The Case of Turkey and Cyprus, Cyprus, A Contemporary Problem and Historical Perspective. He also co-authored with Dr Kyriakides The Case Against the Annan Plan, for the Annan Plan, was put forward in 2004 and was published by Lobby for Cyprus. So again, we're very honoured to have him with us. Before we start, I'd like to say a few introductory remarks and a little bit about Lobby for Cyprus. What do we stand for? We're a non-political human rights NGO. We were formed in 1992. And since our inception, we've campaigned against the invasion, occupation, ethnic cleansing and destruction of the cultural heritage of our island, of 37% of the Republic of Cyprus, which is occupied by Turkey. Lobby believes that being independent and non-aligned has enabled us to maintain our policies and allowed us to evaluate freely the developments concerning Cyprus without any external political forces. We were founded by a number of UK-based Cypriot refugee organisations, Ios Ambrosios, Anglo Aganthou, Lapidos and Garabas, and a number of individuals as well, including our former coordinator, Kyriakos Christodoulou. Now that we all and they all believe that any settlement cannot and should not legitimise Turkey's illegal occupation of the northern part of Cyprus. What do we stand for? We stand for and campaign around the 3 R's: the removal of all Turkish troops, repatriation of all colonists, and the return of all refugees to their homes and lands without restriction or precondition. We strongly believe that any settlement that does not guarantee the implementation of these minimum principles will lead to a bizonal confederation, i.e. two distinct and separate bodies and self-governing bodies on the island of Cyprus. We will never accept a settlement at Lobby that will create an apartheid state in Cyprus. We campaign for all Cypriots, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, but we are made up of Greek Cypriot refugee associations. We want a united Cyprus that's in line with international law. One of the issues that always comes up and why we have the seminar tonight is, what does this mean, a bizonal, bicommunal federation? What do the Greek Cypriots think it means? What do the Turkish Cypriots think it means? Where are we at the moment? Well, the positives are that the Republic of Cyprus had what many agreed was a highly successful 6-month presidency. That began in July 2012. So that was certainly a positive. There are obviously negatives. The banking and financial crisis that took place in the Republic, as was taking place in other parts of Europe, particularly Greece, Spain, Italy. Lost in all of this, of course, was the fact, well, some would say it's lost, that the negotiations between the Turkish Cypriot leader and the President of the Republic of Cyprus, I'm happy to say that Dr Kyriakides is here with us now, so thank you, Klearchos. Just made it in time. Well done, thank you. Of course, the negotiations reached a stalemate in May last year, and there were a number of other factors which converged at the same time. I mentioned the Republic's presidency. Of course, Mr. Eroglu, the Turkish Cypriot leader, decided not to meet President Christofias during the EU presidency, no doubt under instruction from Turkey. Another positive was the discovery of natural gas deposits off the southern Cypriot coast. And also we've got, of course, the national elections coming up in February in the Republic of Cyprus. So all these issues converged and are converging. Negotiations may start after the elections, but Mr. Eroglu's recent statement, again, does not give us much hope. He apparently said, following the Republic of Cyprus elections, the negotiation table will be set up under the roof of the state established by the TRNC. So with that contextualization, I will hand over to Professor Coufoudakis first. Thank you. Yes, of course.
As I said, this reminds me of Baptist revivals, you know, where you have one guy that comes out to work up the crowd and get it ready for the next speaker, who's the real speaker for the evening. So in this kind of context, here I am trying to rally up the crowd, get it ready, and then you're going to hear the real speech from my colleague and friend, Klearchos Kyriakides. I would like to thank you for coming tonight. I would like to thank Theo Theodorou, who of course is not here. He's in Nigeria. He called me from Nigeria this morning. He said, I'm sorry I cannot be present because, etc. Well, reality, traveling, I came in from Athens this morning too. Thanks to the Lobby for Cyprus for the invitation. And also, I'm grateful that Klearchos Kyriakides is with me tonight, because he and I, back in 2004, about this time of the year, had gotten together to speak against the Annan Plan. And here we are again, 9 years later, doing the same thing. Because unfortunately, those of you who believe in the resurrection, this is a case of a resurrection that we have had again in the last few months. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm also pleased to see Fanula Giroux here in the audience, because she has also devoted years and years of her life on the Cyprus issue, working the British documents, finding out details as to who did what, when, and how. She and I are in a regular email dialogue on these issues. I'm pleased that she took the time to be here tonight. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in a free and decisive, I would say, referendum back in 2004, the Greek Cypriot community, because the communities voted at that particular time, turned down a plan intended to destroy the Republic of Cyprus. That was the so-called Annan Plan version 5 that was presented in cooperation with the United Kingdom, because it was really drafted by the United Kingdom, supported by the United States, promoted by Kofi Annan, and here we are again discussing the same thing. But in a free and decisive referendum in 2004, 76% of the Greek Cypriot population rejected a plan that would have legitimized the partition of Cyprus, legitimized Turkey's intervention rights in Cyprus, would have expanded Britain's and Turkey's rights over a sovereign member of the EU. If you have questions on that, I'll be happy to discuss it, because if you have a plan of 9,000 pages, 9,000 plus pages, they had a little chapter expanding on the new rights that the United Kingdom would get in Cyprus years after independence, and that included the territorial waters, the subsoil of Cyprus, and the continental shelf of Cyprus, things that the 1960 agreements never included. But of course, who reads 9,000 plus pages? And in the propaganda of the UN, these things never ever surfaced. Also, the Annan Plan would have deprived all Cypriots, Greek and Turkish, of human rights guaranteed under the European Convention. And I'm going to come back to that point because it's very important. And finally, would have legitimized the demographic changes brought about by the influx of illegitimate, illegal, basically, Turkish mainland settlers who now outnumber the native Turkish Cypriots by something like 3-to-1 ratio, and that's a conservative number. The Greek Cypriots on April 24, 2004, wisely and freely rejected the so-called Bizonal, Bicommunal federation model as the basis for the resolution of the Cyprus problem. But despite the overwhelming rejection of this unprecedented constitutional construct, στα ελληνικά, εγώ το λέω συνταγματική σοφιστία. Oops, let's get excited. We were now once more confronted with a resurrected Annan Plan in an even more dangerous version of the so-called Bizonal Bicommunal Federation. It is the result of nearly 4 years of talks by the outgoing administration of President Christofias and the Turkish Cypriot leadership under the auspices of the UN Special Representative Alexander Downer, a man that I knew very well when he was Australia's foreign minister once upon a time. And at that time, given that he was getting elected in Adelaide, which has a city that has a heavy Greek and Cypriot base, his views on the Cyprus problem were very different than those that he's promoting today. But that's, of course, for history to decide some other day. Anyway, as it happened in previous rounds of UN-sponsored talks since 1975, the burden of concessions has fallen on the Greek Cypriots without any Turkish reciprocity. And I want to emphasize the words Turkish reciprocity because the leadership of the Turkish Cypriot community, whether under Rauf Demirtaş, Mr. Talat or Mr. Eroglu, has failed to present its own proposals for the so-called reunification of Cyprus. Instead, Turkish Cypriot leaders have admitted that their negotiating proposals have been drafted and approved by Ankara. The accumulation of Greek Cypriot negotiating errors, and there are many, includes but is not limited to 1. The acceptance of the so-called Bizonal Bicommunal Federation as the basis for the resolution of the Cyprus problem, without a clear understanding of what these abstract constitutional terms entailed. Second, the failure to demand zero-based negotiations, even though Turkey repeatedly changed the basis for these talks. You know, the talks would start, they would fail, then the US and Britain would come back and say, why don't you go back again, give them something new, make one more concession, we'll get them to the negotiating table. And the history, of course, repeated itself. This is the salamization of the Cyprus problem. You know how you take a big piece of salami and you keep slicing it? Now we're left with the tail, the very end of the salami. The salamization of the Cyprus problem. Well, we're not cooking tonight, but that's okay. The reality is that what we have seen is the failure then to demand zero-based negotiations, even though Turkey repeatedly changed the basis for the talks. For example, two examples. In 1983, Turkey created the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the occupied part of Cyprus and changed the whole nature of the discussion, because from that point on, it began talking about a two-state solution. And the TRNC, in quotation marks, was the beginning of promoting that particular solution. A second point, Mr. Denktash, in his run to Parliament in 1994, rejected the idea of federation as the basis for the constitutional resolution of the Cyprus problem, and said very clearly that from now on we're talking about a confederation. The Turks understood very clearly the difference between federation and confederation. I'll come back to that point in a minute. The deadlocked negotiations, of course, went on. Turkey took for granted all the Greek Cypriot concessions and simply asked for more. And that's why we're in the deadlock that we're in today. Another point that I should talk about is that the Greek Cypriots, in many ways, helped downgrade the Cyprus problem from one of invasion, occupation, and continuing violations of internationally guaranteed human rights to that of a bicommunal problem in need for a constitutional resolution. A fourth problem, that the continuation of the talks in the last couple of years went on, the talks continued in the last couple of years despite threats from Ankara to use force against the Republic of Cyprus if the Republic of Cyprus proceeded with the exploration and exploitation of its own natural resources in its own exclusive economic zone under international treaties that are part of EU law. The 3 treaties on the law of the sea are part of EU law. This is what the Republic of Cyprus did. It acted under that law. Turkey, a prospective member of the EU, refuses to acknowledge the legality of basic laws of the EU and threatened to use force against Cyprus if it went to if it proceeded with the idea to explore and eventually exploit its own resources in its own continental, its own exclusive economic zone. Now, as if this was not enough, the previous Minister of Commerce in Cyprus was even willing to promise Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots a share of Cypriot mineral wealth despite Turkey's threat of force. These promises, of course, have now been adopted by Alexander Downer and British diplomats in order to secure a more cooperative behavior by Turkey and its Turkish Cypriot surrogates. A fifth problem in the negotiations, that the outgoing government of the Republic of Cyprus, along with Alexander Downer, promoted the United Nations mythology, and that's all it is, that in contrast to the negotiations of the 2002-2004 period, the current talks were Cypriot-owned and Cypriot-directed. This was, of course, intended to show that the resurrected Annan Plan did not originate with the UN, but from the 2 Cypriot communities. So, under the direction of Alexander Downer, the Greek Cypriots continued the policy of concessions, and to the proof of that, take a look at a 26-page document that outlined the Greek Cypriot positions in the negotiations of the last 3 years, and the so-called convergence document that is dated 29 January 2012, that shows exactly where and how far the Greek Cypriot positions have moved compared to what the Greek Cypriot positions have been in the past. Of course, these 2 documents, and these are documents of the Republic of Cyprus, show the total disregard for the outcome of the 24 April 2004 referendum. They show the new and tragic concessions that have been made, which include, among others, the acceptance of the so-called 4 freedoms for Turkish nationals in the new Republic of Cyprus. Turks coming from the mainland of Cyprus would have equal rights, political, social, cultural, and everything, in the Republic of Cyprus, assuring, of course, the Turkification of Cyprus, basically. And finally, there was an attempt to attribute the new Greek Cypriot concessions to Mr. Christofias' predecessors. This has been a very funny sort of time period in Cypriot politics, where the government says, we're not at fault. We're not at fault for the economic crisis. We're not at fault for what happened in Mari. And of course, we're not at fault that we brought down the negotiating cards of Cyprus, because we didn't do it, the others did it. From Macarius to now, everybody else is at fault. Therefore, We have not done anything more than simply continue concessions. Well, this may have been true in the case of Tasos Papadopoulos, who inherited the concessions of all his predecessors, Kyriakides, and before that. But in contrast to President Papadopoulos, Christofias went to the negotiation table with a new mandate, and the new mandate that he had in his hands was the outcome of the 2004 referendum, and he blew it. And now we're back to square one, because Downer, of course, is asking to return back to the talks where the talks ended a few months ago. I have to give credit to Turkey for pursuing a consistent policy on the Cyprus problem, because Turkish policy maintains, one, that the Cyprus problem was solved in 1974, meaning the invasion and the occupation of 38% of the Republic. Second, that the creation of the so-called TRNC in 1983 has set the foundation for the two-state solution on Cyprus under a confederation. This solution assures not only the partition of Cyprus, but also Turkey's control over all the island. Another point, there is a demand to end the so-called Turkish Cypriot isolation, even though this so-called isolation is a direct outcome of the Turkish invasion and continued occupation. But it is used today by Turkey to bring about the de facto recognition of the occupied areas. And that's exactly what that process of so-called lifting the embargoes and all that, the isolation, intends to do. And of course, Turkey demands that continuously the Turkish troops remain on the soil of an EU member with expanded intervention rights even after the resolution of the Cyprus problem. Turkey has been clear and consistent. The problem is with the Greek Cypriot side that it has not been, and has been fluctuating from A to Z and accepting things that it rejected before and accepts now. Nobody takes them seriously. As anticipated, the latest round of talks ended in deadlock, and I'll comment very briefly on this issue. One, the acceptance of talks on the basis of the Anglo-American model of the Bizonal Bicommunal Federation amounts to the acceptance of the legitimized partition of Cyprus that Richard Holbrooke demanded of the Greek Cypriots in his mission to Cyprus in May of 1998. I do have that document, his talking points, in my own files. That's one of the precious items that I have. A second point, the Bizonal Bicommunal Federation model is an unprecedented constitutional construct created by the British, promoted by the Anglo-American diplomacy, especially after the 1977 Clark-Clifford visit to Cyprus. It is an unprecedented constitutional construct that has now been incorporated in UN Security Council resolutions drafted by British diplomats at the Security Council. All the resolutions on Cyprus begin at the British mission at the UN. Then the Americans get into it, and then the final product is produced every time they renew the mandate of the UN peacekeeping force, and they include all the various points, the political resolution of Cyprus. Now, it is somewhat ironic that while during the Cold War, England and the United States fought hard to keep the Cyprus issue off the UN agenda, since the end of the Cold War, the two countries have relied on the UN Security Council to promote the Bizonal Bicommunal Federation model as the only legitimate solution of the Cyprus problem. A third point, supporters of the so-called Bizonal Bicommunal Federation have not read carefully Lord David Honey's book on Cyprus. In a most cynical manner, David Honey describes how he and his American counterparts relied on the words are wonderful, constructive ambiguity, okay? With the intent to pretty much mislead the Greek Cypriots about their real intentions and the real meaning of the proposals that they were submitting on the Cyprus negotiations. The Bizonal Bicommunal Federation construct is unprecedented, it is dysfunctional, it is divisive, and it is discriminatory. This is why Alexander Downer is coming back to do the same thing that was rejected in 2004. In reality, the Bizonal Bicommunal model promotes a confederation of two autonomous states on Cyprus. None of the versions of this model presented by Kofi Annan back then and now by Downer and Ban Ki-moon provide for the hierarchy of laws that is normally found in federal constitutions. Federal constitutions in most critical areas give primacy to federal law. In the case of the model promoted for Cyprus, as in all confederations, the central government is a subordinate governmental unit to the two constituent states. This is what they're trying to do today in Cyprus. Finally, and most importantly, the Bizonal Bicommunal Federation, in any of the models presented until now, is in direct violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, a treaty which is the fundamental law of the European Union. This unprecedented constitutional construct is based on discrimination on the basis of ethnicity, language, and religion. This is explicitly prohibited under Article 14 of the European Convention. And needless to say, both Turkey and the Republic of Cyprus have ratified the European Convention. As a law-abiding member of the EU, the Republic of Cyprus must not and cannot accept a constitutional construct that violates the very essence of the rule of law and democracy. Period. Where do we go from here? Especially when Cyprus is headed to presidential elections less than a month from now. Two of the three major presidential candidates talk in terms of a bizonal, bicommunal model with, quote, a proper content. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is no proper content in a discriminatory model intended to destroy a 53-year-old republic. This model can only lead to the Turkification of Cyprus, to the partition of Cyprus, and to the violation of the human rights, the fundamental rights of all Cypriots under the European Convention. Pure and simple. You are here tonight because of your concern about the future of the Republic of Cyprus and of Cypriot Hellenism. Do not be fooled by the sirens promoting the bizonal bicommunal federation model as the model for the reunification of Cyprus. This model will destroy the Republic of Cyprus and formalize its partition. This is the latest manifestation of the plans that have been floating around on Cyprus since the spring of 1964. First with the NATO plan in February, March of 64, the Atchison plans of summer and fall of 64. Since then, these are the plans that have dominated how to destroy the Republic of Cyprus. In 2004, Cyprus avoided its own destruction. The challenge today is to do it also now. Remember that there can be no just and viable solution that violates the rule of law and democracy. If Cypriots do not stand for this very basic principle, no one else will. Freedom, democracy, and the rule of law are fundamental principles required for the survival of Cypriot Hellenism. Cypriot Hellenism will not survive by appeasement, by concessions to Turkish expansionism, and by attempting to please foreign powers. No self-respecting country would accept to destroy itself to please third parties. So if they wouldn't do it, why should we expect the Cypriots to do that? Very plain, simple, rational question. With a sense of responsibility then for the future of Cypriot Hellenism, reject all plans presented under that unprecedented constitutional construct of the so-called bizonal bicommunal federation, a construct that mortgages the future of Cypriot Hellenism to Turkey's neo-Ottomanist ambitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Coufoudakis. Of course, there will be questions at the end. I'm going to leave questions right at the end after Dr Kyriakides' paper. Dr Kyriakides, Klearchos Kyriakides, his paper is entitled The Rule of Law Vacuum, Ethical Deficit and Contradictions at the Core of the Cyprus Question. Very pleased to have Klearchos with us again. Klearchos Kyriakides is a senior lecturer, non-practising solicitor at School of Law at University of Hertfordshire. He's also an executive member of the Hertfordshire Law Society, the West London Law Society and the Society for Modern Greek Studies. He's also a former research fellow at the erstwhile Royal Air Force Staff College and a past president of the West London Law Society. He holds a degree from the University of Birmingham, MPhil and PhD in international relations degrees from the University of Cambridge, and a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from the University of Westminster. As I said earlier, and as Professor Coufoudakis said, Dr Kyriakides also co-authored the case against Anna Bryant in 2004. He needs no introduction. We're very happy to have Klearchos with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. And I must also at the very outset congratulate Professor Coufoudakis for visiting us and for his contribution to scholarship over the decades. One of my first experiences as a student was to pick up a book written by him, and I've been influenced by his ideas and scholarship over the decades, and I'm particularly honoured to be with him this evening. I'm grateful to Lobby for Cyprus for inviting me to address you once again. I must begin with my usual caveat, which is to the effect that what I have to say this evening represents my own views and not the views of any organisation. The title of my contribution is The Rule of Law Vacuum, Ethical Deficit and Contradictions at the Core of the Cyprus Question. The phrase the rule of law deficit was used by the Secretary General of the United Nations without expressly referring to Cyprus when he referred to the rule of law vacuum as a concept which was evident in so many post-conflict societies. The rule of law is a principle of cardinal constitutional importance which lies at the very heart of the Commonwealth and the European Union, of which the Republic forms part. It is also a cardinal principle of the United Nations. Ethics is a concept which owes its philosophical origins to the great book of that name by Aristotle. And Aristotle hovers large in the story of Cyprus. One of the points he makes in his other great book, Politics, is that a constitution can easily be drafted and it can quite easily last for a day or two. The problem is that constitutions have a tendency to fall down, and the objective of any constitution-making process should be to ensure that a constitution lasts beyond the first day or two of its existence. Contradictions at the core of the Cyprus question will become evident as my talk proceeds. I want to do two things in the limited time I have available. The first thing to do is to outline some salient points of history and principles of law which govern and relate to the Cyprus question. And secondly, I want to zoom in on the origins, perceived rationale for, and risks associated with these twin concepts, bicommunalism and bizonalism. My central argument is that both of these concepts are anachronistic, philosophically unsound, morally dubious, and legally questionable. Let's begin now with a little bit of history, which you should hopefully be familiar with. The history of Cyprus, of course, goes back into antiquity, but the starting point for the modern era is, of course, the Zurich-London agreements, which were effectively imposed upon Cyprus as a non-negotiable precondition of partial decolonisation and independence. And remember that the Republic of Cyprus came into being subject to the terms of various treaties which gave rights to two of the former imperial rulers of Cyprus, Turkey and the United Kingdom, together with Greece. But what I want to zoom in on now is the concept of bicommunalism, because the 1960 Constitution, which was effectively imposed on the Republic, was predicated on bicommunal lines. So the bicommunal element of the bicommunal, bizonal mantra owes its origins in the modern era to 1960, although it owes its historical origins to the Ottoman imperial era. Bicommunalism is an Ottoman constitutional concept. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But it's very important at the very outset that we identify those core principles. This is a map that's drawn from the official website of the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence. It's in the public domain. It's Crown copyright material. And you will notice from the map that the United Kingdom does not regard the Republic of Cyprus as de jure partitioned. It regards it as a unitary state, as indeed it is under the 1960 arrangements. The United Kingdom, as we know, asserts sovereignty over two sovereign base areas and regards the island of Cyprus very much as a British base. And Prince Harry returned from Afghanistan via Cyprus earlier this week. The operations in Afghanistan and possibly the discrete ones in relation to Syria are using Cyprus, one suspects. But that's very important by way of background. So the Republic of Cyprus did not come into being as an independent sovereign state in the normal circumstances one finds in Europe. It came into existence subject to concrete binding, although that's questionable in a moral sense, and extensive, let me rephrase that, forgive me, came into existence subject to extensive rights claimed by Greece, Turkey and the United Kingdom. It did not come into existence free from the shackles that that other countries were free from. I'm going to move on, if I may, to the familiar history of the 60s and the 70s. The Republic did not join NATO. It chose in its wisdom to join the non-aligned movement. This exposed it to the tensions associated with the Cold War. In the 60s we saw the intercommunal clashes, the constitutional crisis and the acts of external interference which marred the early years of the Republic's existence. And as a consequence of the activities, it must be said, of paramilitary organisations from all the communities in Cyprus, or the two main communities in Cyprus, if we can use that phrase, which I'm going to later attack, the rule of law was not properly bedded down. Even though the Republic was nominally established as a democracy, the rule of law, as we understand it in the European liberal West, was not embedded. The gun prevailed to a great extent. Politicians thought they were above the law, and external actors in the region behaved as if the law didn't exist. And then we had the Turkish invasion of 1974. And I really want to just read to you something from an English Court of Appeal case. Nothing annoys me more when I hear politicians here in Westminster use weasel words to avoid drawing attention to the reality of what occurred in 1974. Politicians, because they don't want to offend Turkey and they want to play the diplomatic game, love referring to the events of 1974, the episodes of 1974, the conflict of 1974. The English Court of Appeal, in common with a number of English judges, has chosen to call a spade, and in the case of Polly Peck and Marangos of 1998, a case in which the Marangos company lost on a point of law, the Court of Appeal stated that in the summer of 1974, Turkey invaded the island of Cyprus. By the 16th of August 1974, Turkey had occupied a large area in the north, amounting to just over 1/3 of the whole island, which the Court of Appeal referred to as the occupied area. And many members of the Greek Cypriot community in the occupied area fled in fear of armed force from their homes and businesses to the other parts of the island. Now, it was implicit in the use of the words invasion and occupation in that particular court case, and others, which I won't go into, that Turkey had violated international law. It had breached the terms of the United Nations Charter, which prohibit the use of force, save in very limited circumstances to do with the right of self-defence or with the authority of the Security Council, which didn't apply in the case of Cyprus. Turkey cited the Treaty of Guarantee as the justification for its invasion, but even if one accepts the Turkish argument, the Turkish armed forces acted in, to use the Latin phrase, ultra vires, beyond their powers. The Treaty of Guarantee only permitted Turkey to take action with a view to restoring the constitutional order established in 1960. Turkey went beyond its powers and thus acted unlawfully. By either physically uprooting the refugees and displaced persons or constructively expelling them from their properties, Turkey had, as the European Court of Human Rights has confirmed, breached the terms of the European Convention of Human Rights. By procuring the de facto segregation of the Republic of Cyprus, Turkey breached the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, 1965. Interestingly enough, whereas Greece, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Cyprus had signed and ratified that 1965 Anti-Discrimination Convention by 1974, Turkey had only signed in 1972 and had not ratified the convention at the time of the invasion. Turkey didn't get around to ratifying that convention until 1994, if I remember correctly, well after the invasion, and even then it ratified subject to the terms of a declaration, the effect of which was that the terms of that anti-discrimination convention would not apply to states with whom Turkey did not have diplomatic relations. In other words, the Anti-Discrimination Convention of 1965, Turkey asserts, does not apply to its occupation of the north of Cyprus. Now, look at the date, 1965. That was a convention that was introduced against the backdrop formed by the Holocaust during the Second World War, in which Jews were subjected to discrimination of the most repugnant kind. It was also formed by the backdrop of events in the southern states of the United States and the civil rights movement. It was also formed by the backdrop of South Africa and apartheid there, and the assertion of white rule in Rhodesia. So Turkey had violated the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Turkey had also breached the terms of the Treaty of Guarantee by occupying the north of Cyprus and procuring a de facto partition. The Treaty of Guarantee prohibits partition. Within days, and I've looked at some of the declassified documents as well, within days of the invasion, Turkey had started bringing Turkish citizens over from Turkey to the occupied area to populate the occupied area. That was a breach of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Shall I go on? There's one more breach that's worth noting. Turkey endorsed the purported declaration of independence by the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in 1983. Turkey was the only state to recognise that UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, and that, as the United Nations Security Council confirmed, was a breach of international law, and more specifically a breach of the 1960 treaties. So for a multiplicity of reasons, Turkey violated the law and was unable, therefore, to secure a de jure, a lawful partition of the Republic. That sounds like somebody's. Well, unless my voice has activated something.
I think we might have a spy on it.
So that's all by way of background. And I wanted to make one very important point here, and I'm conscious of the time. Why did all of this law come into existence? Look at the dates of those conventions. The Charter of the United Nations, 1945. Geneva Conventions, 1949. The Convention of Human Rights, 1950. The Convention Against Racial Discrimination, 1965. These were the implements of international law which were designed to prevent a recurrence of what had happened on the continent of Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. And I might add, bearing in mind Asia Minor and the forthcoming exhibition on Smyrna here, which you should all attend if you're available, that what had occurred in the First World War and in its aftermath in the 20s. These were introduced as a riposte by the victorious Allies to illegality and as a means of championing the rule of law. Let me just illustrate that telling point with reference to France. Now, France is traditionally kept out of Cyprus, but with the Eurozone crisis, it's now looming ever large in the domestic politics and diplomatic context of Cyprus. What did the Germans do in 1940, shortly after the declaration of war? Germany invaded France. Large numbers of French citizens were displaced from their homes. They became refugees, to use the layman's expression. The Germans carved up France into zones. The occupied zone in the north, the coastal military zone, which was largely free of citizens. The so-called free zone, which was governed by the collaborationist regime of Marshal Pétain, the lawful government of France, of course, represented by de Gaulle and others, was in exile. The Italians occupied a zone in the south-east, and in the east of France, the Germans not only expelled the local population, but they annexed the territories and also established what they called a zone of German settlement, which was intended to be populated by German citizens in an exercise of the Nazi policy of Lebensraum. You can see the parallels here, and they're eerie. And the word zone, of course, was concocted by Dr Kissinger and later adopted by Kurt Waldheim. And Dr Kissinger, of course, is a Jewish emigre from Germany. But one imagines, and I don't know what was in his mind when he came up with the idea of zonality in the mid-70s after the invasion, but one cannot help thinking that he had the activities of Germany in mind during the Second World War when they invaded countries and established zones. And he perhaps also had post-war Germany in mind, which had been carved up into zones asserted by the Soviets, the Americans, the French and the British. So this idea of zonality has the Second World War as its historical basis. And you'll also notice, and hopefully you picked up on this, the other parallels with Cyprus. The occupation of territory, expulsion of the lawful residents and the importation of settlers. That's why those laws exist, because France, being one of the five victorious powers and one of the five leading members of the security, able to contribute to the affirmation of the rule of law in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I'm now coming to Cyprus. As we know, it's now carved up into five segments. The Republic of Cyprus, areas occupied by Turkey, the areas of the Republic which are not occupied by Turkey, the buffer zone which cuts across the middle, and the 2 sovereign base areas. So Cyprus has been carved up into 5 segments. Now we come to the second part of the concluding part of my analysis, which is to zoom in on bicommunalism and bizonality and the contradictions at the heart of the Cyprus question. The Annan Plan was defeated, partly, I think, because of the combined efforts of Professor Coufoudakis and I, and the help of the Lobby for Cyprus. We played a small part in the defeat of the Annan Plan. And as a consequence of that, in spite of the defeat of the Annan Plan, the Republic of Cyprus acceded to the European Union in 2004. And it joined the European Union free from the constraints, restrictions and other provisions in the Annan Plan. And as a consequence, every citizen of the Republic of Cyprus, in common with every other citizen of the European Union, belongs to an organisation which is flawed, as we all know. It's in some respects undemocratic, but on paper at least, it is an organisation which is founded, and I quote here from the treaty itself that governs the European Union, it's founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities, because minorities are as entitled to protection as majorities. There's no discrimination permitted, especially on racial grounds, within democratic states such as the ones that we have in the European Union. And these values are common to the member states of the Union in a society in which pluralism, not racial domination as occurred in Nazi Germany, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity and equality between women and men prevail. And the Union is also predicated on the basis that there should be free movement of peoples and free movement of goods, and there should be freedom, security and justice without internal frontiers. So the Republic of Cyprus joins subject to these noble values, which represent a response and a riposte to what the Germans had been doing in Europe during the 30s and 40s. And remember, the French were one of the 6 founding fathers of the European Union, and they were very much behind this as a project to prevent a recurrence of the First and Second World Wars. The snag for Cyprus is that in their neighbourhood there are countries which do not share the same values. And even though the Republic of Cyprus legally joined this organisation and legally adopted these values, the culture of the Republic of Cyprus has been very much influenced by its imperial past and by its geographical proximity to the Middle East. And nothing demonstrates this better than the observations of General Ozkok, the commander of the Turkish Armed Forces, in a speech he gave at the Turkish War College on the 20th of April 2005. I took this from the website of the Turkish Armed Forces back then. It's now been pulled from the website of the Turkish Armed Forces for some reason. But this is what the General said in 2005, a year or so after the accession of the Republic to the European Union. In terms of the national interests of Turkey and the responsibilities given to her by international agreements, Cyprus represents one of the main issues about which our concern shall never decrease. The importance of Cyprus from a security point of view is based on 2 fundamental principles. One of these is the security responsibility which we have to ensure for our Cypriot kinsmen, and the second is the importance of the strategic role that Cyprus plays in terms of the security of Turkey, as allegedly, he claims, expressed in the treaties of guarantee and alliance. Now, the whole point of the European Union and the whole point of having a democracy under the rule of law is that people are protected by the law as enforced by independent courts. The mindset of our region in the Eastern Mediterranean is that people are protected by a gun. And regrettably, that mindset has influenced the Turkish armed forces. By extension, it's influenced the Turkish government. And by extension, it's influenced, regrettably, the Republic of Cyprus. Because instead of embracing those noble values in the Republic of Cyprus, they have succumbed to the culture of the region and have entered into a negotiation process which is predicated on two principles, bicommunalism and bizonalism, which are completely contradictory to the noble values of the European Union. And let me now, in the final part of my talk, just illustrate to you why they are completely antithetical. This is what has been agreed by President Christofias wearing the hat he was given as Greek Cypriot leader, according to the United Nations, in his joint statement it published. This is what President Christofias agreed with Mr. Talat in 2008, whilst he was wearing his hat as Greek Cypriot leader. It's a subtle point there, but it's worth grasping. The leaders today reaffirmed their commitment to a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality as defined by relevant Security Council resolutions predating the accession of the Republic to the European Union. This partnership will have a federal government with a single international personality, as well as a Turkish Cypriot constituent state and a Greek Cypriot constituent state, which will be of equal status. So the two pillars of this model are bicommunalism and bizonalism. I've already made the point that bicommunalism owes its origins to the Ottoman imperial era. But it has two or three features which are antithetical to European values. The first feature is the one that was articulated by Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, in 1958. Bicommunalism results in administrative partition. So even though the Republic was established in 1960, it was partitioned administratively according to the terms of the Constitution. And this is what the Annan Plan and whatever they've been cooking up in secret is being built on, administrative partition. In 1958, Fatih Zorlu, the then Turkish Foreign Minister, stated that bicommunalism also produces a kind of intellectual partition. What he meant was that one community cannot dominate the other community. But what it also means is that the language that's used in the context of Cyprus is infected with bicommunalism. So we hear everybody, politicians, diplomats, ordinary citizens, referring to the two sides, as if citizens could be carved up into two racial groups. The two communities. The Turkey refers to the two peoples, hopefully they think, as a stepping stone to self-determination for the Turkish Cypriot community. The bicommunal programs. In this country, we've got used to the principles of equality, diversity, and pluralism. What could be contrary to the principles of equality, diversity, pluralism, and I might add, inclusion, than bicommunal programs? How would an Armenian feel if he saw a bicommunal program on education aimed at Greek and Turkish Cypriots? How would a young Syrian Cypriot, who's the son of a refugee from Syria but has a Cypriot passport, feel if he saw a program aimed at Greek and Turkish Cypriots? How would a Russian child with a Cypriot passport feel in that context? We have a population in the Republic of Cyprus now which contains a migrant or non-Cypriot refugee population that has reached 18%, according to the latest census. 18% of the population, the lawful population, I should add, of the Republic of Cyprus consists of non-Greek Cypriots and non-Turkish Cypriots. This isn't the Cyprus of the 60s and the 70s, when bizonalism and bicommunalism were all the rage. We're talking about a completely different entity. The Lidra Street in Nicosia is like Holloway Road. And I see people nodding. How are we going to integrate the new migrants, the refugees from Syria, the refugees from Afghanistan, the Pakistani lad who's lived there for 10 years and has picked up a passport? How are we going to integrate these people if we are tracked by the intellectual partition of bicommunalism? And I want to finish by 5 minutes? Another 5 minutes. That's what's wrong with bicommunalism. It's contrary to the very pillars of European identity. Of course, Professor Coufoudakis worked for many years in the United States. The Americans have the same pluralist culture. That's why President Obama has now become president for the second time. These aren't necessarily European concepts. These are liberal democratic concepts which we in this country benefit from. Mr. Kyriakides is a partner in one of the biggest firms of solicitors in the City of London. His name, Kyriakides, hopefully, has not counted against him or in his favour. He's reached the pinnacle of the legal profession by virtue of his credibility as a lawyer, his education before he qualified as a lawyer, and his character. Professor Coufoudakis reached the pinnacle of the university system in the United States by virtue of his character, his qualifications, his credibility, his scholarship. Not because he was called Coufoudakis or because he was Greek or any other factor that's unnecessary. The Annan Plan, as the 1960 Constitution functioned, was predicated on people reaching positions of power because of their race or religion. This is completely anathema to modern European principles. So enough of that. I've said hopefully enough on bicommunalism to demonstrate how dangerous it is. But let me now close with bizonalism, because this is the most chilling feature of this concept. Can you see the signs there, by the way? I'll come back to those signs right at the end. But that is a sign of the ethical deficit at the heart of the Cyprus question. And it's also a reflection of how everybody has just accepted it. The United Nations, the Republic of Cyprus, the other guarantor powers. I showed that to my colleagues at the university today and they were horrified. But what makes bizonalism most chilling of all is the approach that Turkey has taken towards it. If I can just take you to the next page. Now, Turkey uses oblique terminology. That's diplomatic terminology to describe bizonalism. Turkey states that the Cyprus question must be settled on the basis that restrictions will be placed on three freedoms: freedom of movement, freedom of settlement, and freedom of property. Because that goes against every principle of capitalism, goes against every principle of the European Union, goes against every principle of living in a liberal democracy under the rule of law. We are all, those of us who are European Union citizens can go anywhere in Europe to buy property, open a business, trade and so on. What's chilling about bizonalism is how Turkey interprets it behind the scenes. Now, I've thought long and hard about drawing upon WikiLeaks, but I'm going to draw upon WikiLeaks because there's one document that reveals the essence of bizonalism. And this is a document prepared, it seems, by the American ambassador to Nicosia, but it was certainly issued, according to the WikiLeaks document, it was issued by the United States Embassy in Nicosia and transmitted to Washington, D.C. And if I've got this correct, The meeting was attended by the United States Ambassador in Nicosia and Mr. Sakir Fakili, the so-called Turkish ambassador to the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So they had lunch, and this is what diplomats do after they have lunch. So if you ever go for lunch with a diplomat, remember it will be probably recorded and sent off somewhere. They had lunch, and the ambassador went and wrote down what he thought of the meeting, without knowing that it would end up in the Hellenic Centre in Marylebone a few years later. On Bizonality, a key Turkish Cypriot demand, Mr. Fakili, this Turkish diplomat from Turkey, thought there would be no residential mixing of Turkish and Greek Cypriots post-solution. He quickly clarified his comment, knowing that he said something he shouldn't have said. He quickly clarified his comments, however, stating that there would be ceilings that limited Greek Cypriot settlement in a future Turkish Cypriot constituent state. Note, our pro-solution Turkish Cypriot contacts, both in Talat's office and in the so-called Minister of Foreign Affairs of the TRNC, claim that Turkey wants as ethnically pure a Turkish Cypriot state as possible, even if this means giving up more territory in return. All I can do in response to that is draw to your attention to what Martin Luther King said before he secured the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Segregation ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Dr. King campaigned against the signage and the culture that was prevalent in the southern states of the United States, as one can see from that sign that's been published by the United States government. That's a sign in Georgia in 1943. The middle sign is from apartheid South Africa, and it's used in educational materials published by the United Nations. And the sign on the right tells Greek Cypriots to turn left and Turkish Cypriots to go right. I understand at the Lidra Palace checkpoint, which is maintained by the United Nations. Segregation is not just morally wrong, it's unlawful. It's contrary to the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination, racial discrimination. You can read the provision in your own time. But it states that the parties to the convention particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid, and undertake to prevent, prohibit and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction. I'm approaching 9 o'clock, so I will just draw your attention to additional provisions of European law which reinforce and build upon what the 1965 International Anti-Discrimination Convention stated. Article 1 of Protocol 12 of the European Convention of Human Rights 1950 came into force as recently as 2005. This provides that the enjoyment of any right set forth by law shall be secured without discrimination on any grounds such as sex, race, colour, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth or status. No one shall be discriminated against by any public authority on any grounds such as those mentioned above. And Turkey, by the way, has not ratified that convention provision. And the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights establishes a similar principle and says that everyone is equal under the law, and as a consequence all those forms of discrimination are unlawful. And that, of course, forms the backdrop to the bill currently going through Parliament, which will ensure that if Prince William's first child is a daughter, that daughter will inherit the throne of this country, because we've decided as a country to move on from the discriminatory practices of the past. So, hopefully I've demonstrated here the bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy and the legal questionability of bizonalism. I'm now going to close, ladies and gentlemen, and draw your attention to some fundamental principles and then offer 2 or 3 thoughts before we throw things open to discussion. I began by referring you to Aristotle's Ethics, but in his other book, Politics, he reminded us that man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. And Aristotle in Ethics reminds us that the law is not just a cold, blunt instrument. The law must be associated with justice. And this is what they can't understand in Cyprus, I regret to say, the political class at least. They think that whatever they cook up in secret will be lawful, because it will represent the law. But Aristotle and the Western liberal tradition reminds us that the law, to quote an American judge, must float on a sea of ethics. And this is the theme that Martin Luther King picked up, because the law in the southern states of the United States permitted that racial segregation. The law in South Africa permitted those signs to be put up. The law in Nazi Germany was inherently discriminatory against Jews and Gypsies and others. And in the European Union, as part of the Western liberal tradition, we've decided that the law should not be whatever the politicians say it is, but the law should be inherently just and ethical and moral. The second concluding thought is from our own Lord Chief Justice in this country, Lord Judge of Draycott. Lord Judge was born in Malta to a Maltese mother during a German air raid. His father was English. He came over to this country, he educated himself, became a very senior judge, and is now the most senior judge in this country. He is Lord Chief Justice and head of the judiciary. He reminds us that where the rule of law ends, tyranny begins. It is an adaptation of the great phrase of John Locke. And it's interesting that the President of the Supreme Court of this country is Jewish, Lord Neuberger, and the Master of the Rolls of this country, Lord Dyson, is also Jewish. And the Lord Chief Justice, who is the head of the judiciary and the top judge, is Maltese by birth and by his mother. You can reach the top in a multi-ethnic society irrespective of your background, and that is how the Cyprus question should be resolved. It should be resolved on a multi-ethnic, unitary, democratic basis that's predicated on the rule of law. And I've mentioned the Jewish background of those 2 judges. My eye was caught by a rather interesting statistic. In 1966, there were no more than 30 Jews on the island of Cyprus. Today, there are approximately 2,000. Since 2005, Cyprus has had its own chief rabbi, its own synagogue, even its own supplier of kosher food. The Jewish community is expanding. I understand for various reasons. One is that there are Israeli citizens who are coming over for business purposes. There are British, French, German citizens who are leaving Germany or France or the UK and going to live in Cyprus. And interestingly enough, as I understand it, from what I've heard anecdotally, there are some Israelis who are eligible for a Polish or a Lithuanian or an Estonian passport in view of their backgrounds and connections to those countries, and they're picking up their passports from the Lithuanian embassy or wherever it is, whichever European Union embassy it is, and they're hopping over to Cyprus to escape the conflict the conflict with the Palestinians, but to stay within the region. That community is growing. How can we be talking about 2 communities? We must surely be talking about one community under the rule of law. One community with several languages, with Greek and Turkish perhaps enshrined in the constitution as the 2 primary languages, with Islam and Christianity given certain rights in certain spheres. But we shouldn't build a constitution around Christian Greeks and Muslim Turks. And this reminds us of what Anthony M. Kennedy, the United States Supreme Court Justice, said. When we talk about the rule of law, we assume that we're talking about a law that promotes freedom, promotes justice, and promotes equality. Justice Kennedy is Roman Catholic. The President of the United States is Barack Obama, and he is of mixed race background. And earlier this week he was inaugurated to become the President for the second time, and he said a few things that I'd like to read out to you today to close my contribution. And these are the guiding principles I would submit that ought to be planted into Cyprus to replace bicommunalism and bizonalism. Each time we gather to inaugurate a president, we bear witness to the enduring strength of our constitution. We affirm the promise of our democracy. We recall that what binds this nation together is not the colours of our skin or the tenets of our faith or the origins of our names. What makes us exceptional is our allegiance to an idea articulated in a declaration made more than 2 centuries ago. And it was a declaration, I might add, that was influenced by the ancient Greeks generally and by Aristotle in particular. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I can do no better than close with President Obama's words. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree we've had 2 excellent speeches tonight. We're very privileged to have both these gentlemen with us. We're also very privileged for you to be able to ask some questions. What I would ask is, if you do have a question, please, can you say who you are and which organisation, if you're of an organisation, you represent? And can you please ask a question and make it short as possible, because I'm sure there'll be quite a few. We have 2 young ladies going round with microphones. Elizabeth over here and Bruno over there. Okay, you put your hands up so I can see. Okay, should we have the gentleman in the middle there, please?
Stavros Polivriou for Dr. Coufoudakis. You said that the bicommunal solution would be unprecedented. So, from what I can see, is any solution proposal for Cyprus would be unprecedented. But could you give us an example of 2 federal countries which have the exact same functionality of the federation? And the second question, in theory, we would all prefer a non-federal democracy. But in 1974, or after Makarios was overthrown, we gave Turkey a chance to illegally invade. Do you think that abandoning the UN-approved bicommunal solution and our over 35-year-old governmental policy would give a reason for a final division? And do you think that this might not be real politics? And for Dr. Kyriakides, one question.
Should we let Professor Coufoudakis answer those questions first, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps we can take several questions to simplify the process, and then we can comment more.
Okay, should we have,
So for Dr. Kyriakides, a solution has to be accepted also both by the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, right? You have condemned bicommunal programs, but these activities, from my personal experience, can certainly help one understand how people of the other community think. Do you have any suggestion that would be acceptable by the Turkish Cypriots and would make them feel they have the same chances in a united Cyprus and not a not, and I'm saying a united Cyprus and not in a really multicultural country such as the United Kingdom.
Okay, let's take those questions now, please. Professor Coufoudakis.
If I caught your question correctly, you're talking about why is it unprecedented? Well, it's unprecedented because there is no other constitutional system that reflects the values that were incorporated in the Annan Plan or in the versions that we've had since the time of Mr. Christofias and his round of negotiations. So the model they're putting on the table has nothing that is similar in the rest of Europe or in the rest of the democratic world. During the course of the 1980s, Mr. Denktash realized that, well, perhaps we can find some points from the Belgian constitution, from the Swiss constitution, and things like that. These are flawed ideas because it's like reading Marx and finding one particular line and saying, oh, that's a wonderful concept, we'll incorporate that. There's a cut and paste job that happened. Switzerland, Belgium, and their current constitutions and their current problems are the product of historical experience. It was not a cut and paste job where we found references to communalism or to linguistic separatism and things like that and say that these systems do work today. So that's part of the unprecedented comment that I've made. Federation, if you look at federal systems, be they in Germany, in Brazil, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, central law, federal law prevails. In none of the models that have been put on the table, federal law literally prevails over anything. It's the two states that govern. And therefore, that's the typical characteristic of a confederation. The United States started off as a confederation, and because the system failed, they went back to Philadelphia several years later, and we in the US today live under the constitution we have, which is a true federal constitution. So I don't know if I missed anything else.
I think the other part of the question, I think, was if you abandon this zonal bicommunal, and after, I think, 35 years of the Republic of Cyprus government pursuing this sort of solution, what is
the solution is going to be one where you can revamp the 1960 Constitution, bring it up to date, bring it in conformity with the European Convention on Human Rights and all the legislation of the European Union, because, after all, the true native Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots are now citizens of the EU, and I want to stress the word the true Turkish Cypriots, not the settlers that have come from Anatolia. So therefore, what both sides ought to be looking at is a revision of the Constitution of 1960 to bring it to conformity with democratic norms and to bring it in conformity with European law and the European Convention.
Thank you. The final question was to Klearchos. It was to do with the bicommunal approach and what comfort could be given to the Turkish Cypriots.
Yes, before I just address that question, a very quick footnote to what's been said about federations. When they came up with this idea of bizonal federalism in the 70s after the invasion, federalism was regarded as a relatively successful constitutional model. Since then, we've seen one federation after another come crashing down. I can think of four off the top of my head. The USSR, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Sudan, I think, is the latest that's gone. And even in this country, look at this country. This country is not a federation, but we decided to devolve power from Westminster to Edinburgh. So we transferred power on a devolved basis, short of full federation. And look where it's left us 10 years later. The Scottish nationalists have seized power in Scotland legally, and they are legally going about a process which they hope will result in the partition of this country. So it's very dangerous to take power away from central governments and transfer it to the regions. And that's especially the case in small territories. That's the footnote. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say is this is why it's dangerous to refer to the partnership of two communities. As Mr. Frangaskili will know, the first principle of a partnership is that it's an association of people who want to come together, but they will only stay together as a partnership for as long as they want to stay together. And that's why I don't understand why President Christofias put his signature to a document which had the word partnership in. Did he have any legal advisors advise him on constitutional, European Union, public international law matters before he signed that document? On the substance of the gentleman's question, I have no objection to programmes which are open to all citizens, and indeed all lawful residents, irrespective of background. The problem that we've had with the bicommunal programmes is they've entrenched the intellectual partition of the Republic of Cyprus. And what they've done is they've produced a problem which is not going to be felt today, but may be felt in the next 5 or 10 years. Look at this country. Before we had this multi-ethnic society that we're now benefiting from, we went through the Notting Hill riots of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. We had I remember the Toxteth riots in the early 80s. Now, before our migrant communities felt fully at home, there was a great deal of racism displayed towards them. And it wasn't just direct racism, it was indirect racism. And these bicommunal projects are by their very nature racist, because they are excluding by their terminology anybody who is not a Greek Cypriot and not a Turkish Cypriot. You asked for some suggestions as to how the Turkish Cypriot citizens of the Republic could feel at home. Very good question. I would offer two suggestions off the top of my head, although one is one that I've argued about before. There needs to be a fully functioning campaign of public education, so that people in the Republic of Cyprus are aware of the history of their own continent, Europe, so that they are aware of the civil rights struggle in the United States, so that they are aware of what democracy and the rule of law means, so that they are aware of their rights as citizens. Can I just take a straw poll here? Can you put your hands up if you watch RIC or any of the other Cyprus broadcasting services on a reasonably regular basis? Keep your hands up if you've seen a documentary about the Holocaust. Put your hand up. Very good. Put your hands up if you've seen a documentary about the civil rights movement in America. On RIC. On RIC. On RIC. Have you seen anything about the Holocaust? On RIC. They may show but it's not as prevalent as it is here. We are brought up every week. There's a programme on the radio and television about the Holocaust, about the civil rights movement, about the principles that we hold dear. In Cyprus, and I watch Greek and Cyprus television all of the time, I don't sit So my point, the gentleman's raised a very important point. Public education is one way. And the other way is, if you read the Ombudsman reports from Cyprus, he or she makes the point that many Turkish Cypriots feel uncomfortable going to public offices of the Republic where there are no services in Turkish, the Turkish language. I don't know the details of that, but I have no objection to the opening of Turkish language services in the public sector of the Republic of Cyprus, or at least English services. I'm speaking off the record there. I don't know enough about the subject. You raise a valid point, sir.
Further questions, please. The gentleman over there, in the corner.
From Cyprus News Agency. A quick question for both of you. If you can describe a comprehensive course of action, political, diplomatic, that will achieve a solution that doesn't include a federal state.
You propose a solution to a comprehensive approach to the Cyprus issue that doesn't include a bizonal, bicommunal federal. The way to achieve as you said, based on the 1960s revamping, how would you do it if you were the President of the Republic of Cyprus?
That's what I would put on the table the next time Mr. Downer calls on the parties in quotation marks to get together to talk about resolving the Cyprus problem. There is a constitution. Turkey said it wanted to intervene in 1974 to bring back the existing constitutional order that had been affected by the invasion. By the coup d'etat against the government of President Makarios. Now, there is a constitution, the constitution remains valid. Do the proper amendments to which actually the Turkish Cypriots had agreed to in 1972, in the talks 72-74, bring a modern constitution of Cyprus with the stuff that I talked to you about before. Laws that comply and conform to European standards.
I've just put that map up of Europe because it struck me this morning that David Cameron has now called for a referendum, hasn't he? With a view to us voting as whether or not to stay in the European Union. But in the meantime, he will try and negotiate an agreement with the rest of the European Union so that the United Kingdom can have a better ride, as it were. That's provoked an interesting reaction. This morning in the Times, David Owen, the former Foreign Secretary of this country, stated that Mr Cameron's position is an example of British exceptionalism. And what the Cyprus negotiations are is an attempt to produce a Cypriot exceptionalism within the European Union. But I was more struck by the French Foreign Minister's reaction to Mr Cameron's remarks. The French Foreign Minister said that the European Union is a club in which, or it's like a club in which everybody plays football with a round ball. So what the British are trying to do is to stay within the club but play rugby with an oval ball. And that's exactly what they're trying to do in Cyprus. If you have a look at that map though, look at the islands that are on display. Crete is in enosis with Greece, so enosis is off the cards, especially now that Greece is bankrupt. Sicily is in enosis with Italy, Corsica with France, and the Balearics, what they call the ones off Spain, are in enosis with Spain. So that constitutional model is out. The other constitutional model is Ireland. Not a very good model to adopt, it's being partitioned. The United Kingdom could be on the verge of partition now with the Scots, so that's not a good model. But there are two islands which are sovereign states. One is Iceland. It's a multi-ethnic democracy under the rule of law, and it's unitary. And the other one's in the Mediterranean. It's called Malta, a multi-ethnic democracy under the rule of law. Alexander the Great was confronted with a Gordian knot, and he sliced it in one fell swoop. Well, I don't think we should go back to bizonalism, bicommunalism. We should put them into the coffin together with Jimmy Savile and everything else that was popular in the 1970s. Use Malta and use Iceland as our constitutional models.
Thank you. That reminds me of something that Alexander Downer said to us at the House of Parliament last year. We at Lobby, as you can see, we don't shirk from discussing the core issues openly and freely and debating them. And Theo Theodoro, our coordinator, who's not here tonight, he's in Nigeria on business, confronted Mr Downer and basically made a lot of these points that our eminent speakers have made tonight about the defects in this approach. And Mr Downer's response effectively was, don't be silly, that's not realistic. Turkey won't agree to that. So that's the mentality of what we're dealing with, and why we have to listen to people like this panel and try and find another way of making the UN, our own people, understand this isn't going to work.
Can I just on that point? Martin Luther King was told, "You're living in a dreamland. The southern states, the governors in the southern states won't accept this. You're living in a dream world." And the lesson of Martin Luther King is stick to your principles, stand up for law and justice, and do not succumb to political pressure.
But it was just quite nice the way he said Turkey will never accept that. Just going on from something Professor Coufoudakis said about Downer being from Adelaide. He's now a true UN diplomat. Can I have the gentleman here has been having his hand up quite some time over here in the corner. Can you use the microphone, please?
Yeah, Andreas Gaffouri, my parents are both from Nicosia, and I was Cyprus. I just want to clarify something. Am I right in assuming that the argument against Bizonal and Bizonanism, by communism in Cyprus, the argument against it based just on because of the multi-ethnicities in Cyprus now, that's only a minor point, isn't it? Because if we had no other ethnicities apart from only Greeks and only Turks, then we obviously wouldn't be advocating it's okay because we've only got two communities, Greek and Turk, therefore it's okay. That's not, that's correct, is it?
Yes,
we're against it as an ethical, moral and legal thing, even with only two communities, isn't that right?
That's right.
Thank you very much.
It's an opportunity for me to just make a point.
That's all right. And it's quite interesting to hear about some of the points that Klearchos made, including his comments about Kissinger adopting some of the Nazi Germany's approach to Bizonal. So I thought that's quite interesting, and would be appreciated, no doubt, by Kissinger being a realpolitik supporter. Should we just carry on? Can I have Mr. Kanoukias, former coordinator of Republic of Cyprus?
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you to the panellists for excellent presentations. It's pretty obvious that if you carry on doing the same things in the same way, having the same arguments, you're going to achieve exactly the same results. Nothing will change. So my question is this: why are we scared of actually changing matters? What is to stop us, and this is a rhetorical question perhaps, calling a meeting with the UN, with the Turks, coming along and saying, you know, boys, we've been doing this for the last 37 years. We've not achieved anything. We've had the same arguments. Bizonality cannot work. Bicommunalism cannot work. Go through each of the agreements, each of the plans, explain why they haven't worked, put forward some of the arguments we've heard this evening, and say, you know what, let's tear this all up. Let's forget it. No, forget Bizonality, forget Bicommunalism. Here's a piece of paper with some proposals from us as to how we can take things forward. But by the way, they're based on the rule of law, EU norms, UN Security Council resolutions, EU freedom of movement provisions. Please explain to us why these principles cannot now form the basis of discussion. Now, what will happen? Are we scared that they will say, well, this is ridiculous, forget it, you can't now change the plans? Is everyone going to suddenly turn around and recognise the so-called TRNC? I've had many meetings at the Foreign Office, and the one thing that's pretty clear to me is the British do not want to recognise the Turks. So what is to stop us from tearing everything up, telling them to sod off, Bizonality is not here, we're not going to accept it, this is what we're going to negotiate on? What do we lose?
You know, this is why I talk to you about the mistakes that have been done in the negotiating process on the part of the authorities of the government of Cyprus over the last 30 plus, almost 40 years. We always waited for somebody else to come to solve the Cyprus problem for us, and then simply say, no, the model you're putting on the table is unacceptable. This is why I came back to you today and I said to you, go back to the principle of the zero-based negotiations and put on the table a workable model for a Cyprus that belongs to the 21st century in the European Union. And you can do that by taking the constitution that exists, revamping it, amending it, bringing it up to date to conform with current standards, legal standards and political standards. So returning to a zero base, there's nothing wrong with that. It just takes a little bit of political courage and say that it has not worked. The systems that you guys have put on the table are unacceptable for the following reasons. Here is an alternative model. And take the initiative. Don't wait for the apomechanis theos, deus et machina, to come down to present a model that we're going to say later on we don't agree to it.
Can I just first of all respond to the gentleman? It's a very telling point. It gives me an opportunity to say something I didn't have time to draw attention to. I looked up the definition of communalism in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it includes the following sentence. Communalism, which is of course what bicommunalism flows from, communalism entails allegiance to one's own ethnic group rather than to the wider society. That takes you to the very basis of what's wrong with this constitutional concept. There was an article written, a book rather, written by Curtis F. Jones, a retired American diplomat, entitled Divide and Perish, The Geopolitics of the Middle East. And he argues in his book that communalism, which is a legacy of Ottomanism, is one of the factors behind the conflicts that drive the Middle East. And he comments, in the geopolitical evolution of the Middle East, exclusivist policies have prevailed. Most of its inhabitants are afflicted by inclines them to pay ultimate loyalty, not to their class or political party or to the state, but to their ethnic in-group. And he adds dolefully, this affliction has exacted a dreadful toll in political discord, in vulnerability to foreign exploitation, in ethnic cleansing, and in a dreary concatenation of inconclusive wars. Inconclusive wars. And he has Cyprus in mind. So this communalism, it's just inherently defective, and it should be consigned to history. And the other point I wanted to make was about Mr. Gounoubbias's point, Mr. Gounoubbias's observation. I have a feeling that that we're entering into a new Cold War. Perhaps we are not in substance, but the rhetoric is very much along these lines. Mr. Cameron described the events in Algeria as heralding a new era in the British relationship with North Africa. When Sir Malcolm Rifkind, the former Foreign Secretary, referred to North Africa as the soft underbelly of Europe in a Churchillian flourish, Mr. Cameron agreed with him. Today, Hillary Clinton was discussing the attack on the embassy in Benghazi, or the consulate in Benghazi, on the 11th of September last year, and she said that this is a reflection of how the North Africa is now afflicted with Islamist violence. Look at the Republic of Cyprus. It's now becoming encircled by Islamist movements in Libya, in Egypt, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and in Turkey. And in Syria, perhaps. If that is the case, then I would suggest, if I can borrow a phrase lifted from the Cold War and used in the context of Turkey, that the Republic of Cyprus is a bulwark against Islamism. Nothing could be more dangerous than to establish a religiously flavoured, nationally based Turkish Cypriot constituent state in the north and a similarly based constituent state in the south. We need to integrate the Republic of Cyprus and ensure that no area is religiously based, because that, history shows, gives rise to what this American diplomat referred to: violence, bloodshed, terrorism. And looking at it in a positive way, if the Republic of Cyprus can be built as a multi-ethnic democracy under the rule of law, it will act as a precedent for the establishment of genuine democracy, genuine equality, and genuine law in the Eastern Mediterranean basin. That's what I would put to the diplomats before tearing up bicommunalism and bizonal.
Sorry. So time is moving on. What I'm going to do is take 2 or 3 questions in one go. Start with the gentleman here first, please. Could you say your question, then we'll move on to the gentleman next to you, as it makes it quicker.
Thank you. Professor Coufoudakis has referred to the contrast between the Turks pursuing a consistent policy while the Greek handling has been ridden by contradictions and confusions. One obvious example is the famous high-level agreements of 1977 and 1979. These agreements were violated by Mr. Bektas in 1983 when he declared the so-called state in the occupied territories. In spite of that, our side insists that these agreements bound us in perpetuity. And of course, they refer to Makarios and some other silly explanations. Thank you.
Can you raise your hand to ask a question? Okay. Any more questions, please? Raise your hand. Okay. So let's see who wants to ask. Okay. We'll take the lady next to you next, and then we'll answer the three or make some comments.
Yes. Is there any truth in the Turkish Cypriot claim that the European Union, when asked by them, they informed them that the European Union would accept any agreement between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots?
Thank you. Over here, please. One more question in the middle. And then we'll have some comments from the speakers on those three questions.
My name is Ellie, and thank you very much to both speakers for addressing these points. It's been a long time coming. So firstly to Dr. Coufoudakis,
Could you speak a little
Can you
louder?
hear me?
I can't hear you. My name is Coufoudakis.
Okay, so my first question is to yourself. Last week, Kofi Annan was in London, and he was asked by a young Cypriot girl if what he would change if he could have the chance to do everything again. And he said a big mistake was when Cyprus was admitted to the EU. Now, would you say that having the EU presidency was used to, like, was maximised, can I say, to bring attention to the Cyprus problem? And how do you think? Okay, it's not really a question. Do you understand what I mean? Okay, sorry. So, do you think Cyprus used its position in presidency of the EU to bring light to the situation and to kind of help?
I think the President of Cyprus deliberately didn't. That's my understanding.
Yeah.
He deliberately decided not to, because he wanted Cyprus to be seen to be professional.
Yes.
That question then is whether you agree with that, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, that's.
Sorry, I have a question
one more.
To Dr. Kyriakides. So you've touched on the kind of narrative, the labels that we use, their side, our side, Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot. I would completely agree with you that it's morally and ethically wrong, and you've laid those reasons out perfectly, but it's also disadvantageous to our cause, in that a common misconception of Cyprus is that it's Greek Cypriots versus Turkish Cypriots. Obviously, we know that it's the Republic of Cyprus versus an occupying force. Don't you think, how do you think we could convince Cypriots and the politicians to change those labels, which would make such a difference in the public eye? On that note, why don't we have Turkish Cypriots in the negotiating table on the side of the Republic of Cyprus? Because they're under our constitution, they're in our republic. And moreover, why don't Cypriot children in the Republic of Cyprus get taught basic Turkish? It's an official language of our country. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to answer those questions?
The gentleman raised the point about the European Union's acceptance of a settlement. Yes. Well, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, what the European Union has said is they will accept a settlement of the Cyprus question provided it's consistent with European Union norms and values, which isn't quite the same thing as some Turkish Cypriots may have alleged. What some Turkish Cypriot nationalists and what Turkey is concerned by is the possibility that refugee organisations and other interested citizens might challenge the legality of any constitutional mechanism that is incompatible with EU law. So they would like the EU treaties to be amended. So they would like, for example, that provision to say the European Union has founded all of those principles, with the exception of, in the context of the Republic of Cyprus. At the moment, they know that the principles are so contrary that they could be challenged in court. And we have cases, I won't bore you with the details, we have cases from both the European Court of Human Rights, which is a non-EU court, and the European Court of Justice, which is the EU court, that confirm you can challenge what politicians do and provisions of law that are incompatible. The other point that I wanted to make on the 1977-79 texts, which have somehow metamorphosed into high-level agreements. because they were referred to as such by the United Nations in the 1990 Security Council resolution. I refer everyone in Cyprus to what Lord Denning said in an English case from the 1970s. That case, I'm paraphrasing here, it concerned English champagne, and the English manufacturers of English champagne said, well, we've been making English champagne for centuries. You know, the English law allows us to make English champagne. And Lord Denning said, but by joining the European Union under the 1972 European Communities Act, European Union law acts as a tidal wave that flows up the estuaries and covers everything in its path that is incompatible with European Union law. And I would just take that very simple principle of English law, which is also part of European Union law, and apply it to the 77-79 agreements. European Union law has washed over those agreements, and they should start afresh. The final point to make is in relation to Evie's point. I didn't have time to go into my traditional attack on the procedure on the Cyprus question. Why should Armenians be excluded from the negotiations? The Annan plan had provisions to do with the Armenians and their educational status, and why were they excluded? What about the 60,000 British citizens who live on the Republic of Cyprus? Why should they be excluded? Why should the refugees in this country be excluded from the process? Why, for example, were the doctors, as I understand it, why were the doctors not consulted over the medical provisions of the Annan Plan and the health service provisions before the Annan Plan? Was the judiciary consulted before the judicial provisions of the Annan Plan were drafted? You know, in modern European democracies, we have what's called consultation. The Scottish government consulted everyone in the United Kingdom before embarking upon its moves towards a referendum. The British government has done likewise. That's what modern European democracies do. And they publish documents, maybe not all of them, but they publish documents and seek views. That model of modern, transparent, liberal democracy has not been applied in Cyprus. And it's not just the process, it's not just the substance that's defective and rotten, the process is rotten as well.
The comment that I want to make about the EU. In 1998, the government of Cyprus, when they entered the more serious phase of the negotiations, made a very interesting proposal. It asked Turkish Cypriots to join in the negotiating team for the accession of Cyprus to the EU. Who turned it down? Turkey. Because Turkey insisted that there will be two separate track negotiations, one involving the so-called TRNC and the other one the Republic of Cyprus. That way you legitimize the illegal entity created in 1983 in the occupied areas. So the offers have been made, the offers have been turned down by another side. Now, the case of the Europeans, in many ways, remember, the EU, and I have always been an advocate of the EU has also become a bureaucratic organization, and to a large degree does not want to inherit any more problems than it already has. So if the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots agreed to the Annan Plan, they said, okay, we'll accommodate it, as long as it does not really truly contradict principles, a kind of vague statement in that Article 10. So, and on top of that, they have British diplomacy and American diplomacy trying to keep the EU off the negotiations in Cyprus. Look at what happened when we were in the final stages of the Annan Plan in 2004. The only thing the United States, Britain and Turkey agreed to was for the EU to have an observer in the Bergenstock talks for the sake of blessing whatever agreement Kofi Annan was going to impose at Bergenstock on the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. So that is reality. And they never wanted the EU to get actively involved for the very simple reason because they knew that if the EU got involved, there are the principles that Klearchos talked about, built into the EU treaties that would make totally incompatible those kinds of schemes that Kofi Annan and his successors are trying to put on the table. That's why. Let me close with a final comment that will show you the funny things that happen in international politics. We all talk about how Israel and Cyprus today are on the same side of the fence. Well, that has not always been the case, because from the 1990s on to about 2010, Turkey and Israel had a very, very close political, economic, and military relationship, as you all very well know. Then Turkey made the switch. We had the Marmara incident, etc. In 2004, I was in Cyprus, and I was involved very much in the background of negotiations and stuff. We had a delegation that came from Israel to do propaganda on behalf of the Annan Plan. Andreas Theophanous, a colleague of mine in Cyprus, and I were in the forefront of the fight against the Annan Plan. So the delegation asked to meet with us to explain to us why we should moderate our position and not oppose the Annan Plan. We had a lengthy meeting in our offices at the University of Nicosia. They failed to convince us, and then another day they invited us to a lunch downtown in the very center of Nicosia, right before the Lydra Palace crossing. And it was an inconclusive meeting. It got very lively. And at one point or another, I turned around and I told my Israeli colleagues, okay, if you're so much in favor of the Annan Plan, you know, you also have a problem. Why don't you give it to the Palestinians? Well, I can tell you one thing. Our lunch ended very abruptly that day.
Okay, we'll take two. That's fine.
Why don't we capitalize on the Haram? Okay. Who knows here about the Haram Teke in Larnaca? Everybody knows about it. But the importance of this place, you said rightly, we don't want the Cyprus to be the North Muslim and the South Greek Orthodox. But this one is supposed to be the fourth place in the world for Muslim people. Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, and this place. We protected it. I mean, our churches suffered, and we know that they ended up, the mosaics everywhere, all over the world. And we protected this place. This is something we have to put on the table, on the negotiations. It's a strong point, and I'm sure the Americans and other people who are not aware of it will appreciate that point.
Just look in your own time, look up what is going on in relation to the funding of Islamist movements in the region, because it is quite worrying. The Turkish Cypriots were traditionally Turkish Cypriots. The Turkish government is now repeatedly referring to them as Muslim Turkish Cypriots and emphasising their connection to their religion. If you go to the website, for example, of the Turkish Ministry, or if you read Dr Davutoglu's book, they are referred to as Muslim Turkish Cypriots. And this is a reflection of the broader the growth of Islamism in the region. We need to embrace Islam as part of the traditional architecture of the island of Cyprus. But what we are seeing is a set of developments in the island and in the region which are out of kilter with the traditional approach. Just one last point about the religious dimension. Some of I've been reading about the new settlements of Jews on the island of Cyprus, and one or two of the Jewish commentators have made a very interesting point. They don't refer to the settlement of Cyprus by Jews in a migratory sense. They refer to the return of Jews to the island of Cyprus 2,000 years after they were expelled by the Romans. And indeed, the Romans imposed the original Annan Plan on Cyprus, because when they expelled the Jews from Cyprus, they imposed a ban on their return.
The one thing that I can tell you about the mosques, I've been going to occupied areas of Cyprus since the spring of 1976. Indeed, the growth of the mosques is incredible. And it's not only funded by Turkey, it's funded by Saudi money. And one particular person who is head of the Turkic Studies program in Oregon is a Turkish Cypriot whose family and he himself were persecuted and basically ran out of Cyprus because he exposed a lot of the funding from Saudi Arabia to the religious schools and also to the building of mosques and things like that. So it is not just what Mr. Erdogan is doing right now with his own Islamic fundamentalist philosophy, it's the money that is coming also from Saudi Arabia.
And this is my fear with some of the new migrants and refugees that are arriving in Cyprus, because if we don't integrate them into society, we will have the equivalent of the London Underground bombings in Cyprus, because some of these new migrants and refugees are Syrian or from Afghanistan or from Iraq. They need to be integrated and they're by all means allowed to keep their faith, but they shouldn't be sucked into the Islamism that's penetrating the region. I'm very worried about that. No one's talking about it, but it is a feature of the Cyprus question that needs to be addressed before it is too late.
Can I take, it's getting late, so what I'd like to do is take the last 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then we've got drinks afterwards. I mean, how many questions have we got? How many people want to ask questions? Okay, let's make them all quick. We've got 1 lady there, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we'll start here, Maliki. And we'll have all those 5. Keep your hands ready. Can you ask the question as quickly as possible? It's getting late.
I'd like your comments, please, on why President Christofias continuously says that unless we go for Bizonal or Bicommunalism, that Cyprus will be divided. And really, as a follow-up on that, who is Cyprus's Martin Luther King? Who is that person who's going to stand on the podium, put his neck on the line, and take our country forward?
Thank you. Next question, please. Hands up. As the gentleman's there closest, please. Can we have this question next, please?
I think there was a missing of a point earlier. The lady, I think, asked about the Tekei Larnaca. I think she's trying to point out that we respect and we have not done no damage to the cultural, fourth most important Islamic, shall we say, shrine in Cyprus, whereas the Turks and Turkey and the rest of them, Saudi Arabia, they're destroying our culture and also stealing everything and exporting it. I think we have not heard from any politician.
I think
we have never seen anything on the media.
In Cyprus are quite too frightened to rock the boat.
And another issue which I picked up on was we were asked a question about what are we seeing on Greek and Cyprus television. We're being bombarded continuously with the Holocaust. They're indoctrinating, making us feel sorry for the Israelis. Nobody's indoctrinating the Israelis to understand what they're doing to the Palestinians. And what is being done to us is wrong. That comparison really hurts me as a scholar of human rights. And I think Olympias knows I've got a website on human rights, followed by thousands of people worldwide. I'm really concerned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have the next question. As you're sitting there, have a lady here, please. And then we'll have a gentleman at the back.
Thank you. A very quick question. The application of rule of law implies that meritocracy also has an effect on meritocracy. In your view, how ready is the Greek Cypriot community for the application of true meritocracy, even if that means that second-generation immigrant becomes, I mean, can we have an Obama in Cyprus anytime soon, or anybody?
The law.
How ready is society to accept that? Because you're proposing something that society has to accept. Are they ready?
Was the gentleman at the back as well? And I think that's probably going to be it for tonight. Is there anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Hertfordshire. I'm a refugee from Cyprus. I was 5 years old when the war happened. In a solution by Bizonal, Bicommunal, they guarantee that me and the other 200,000 refugees, they're going to go back to their homes, where our ancestors, thousands of years, they were over there living in our houses. And they are actually going to go back and live there. And another thing you have to keep in mind, Ahmed Dawoodoglu, in his book he wrote Strategiko Bathos, he said, even if it wasn't any Turkish Cypriot in Cyprus, we would create one. So we can claim a Turkish state in Cyprus. And they won't stop to the Bizonal Federation of Turkish. If you look them up there, the only island is stopping to come to the Mediterranean is Cyprus underneath. And if they get the whole of Cyprus, then they come to the Mediterranean. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question. Can you put your hand up if you really wanted to ask a question? The lady here at the front, please, with the final question tonight.
What I would like to ask...
Can you put the microphone closer, please?
The question of rule of law, you said so beautifully earlier on, and in other many speeches when we've been together, you have always mentioned it about the rule of law. And what I see every day, no one is practicing the rule of law. So would there be any stronger voice that the rule of law would make it acceptable and workable?
You're basically saying that effectively we're arguing about the rule of law, preserving the concepts, the principles, but is Cyprus ready for it? I think it's similar to the question asked earlier.
Yes, the lady, yes, said a similar question, yes.
Should we start? Thank you very much. That's finished. Thank you very much. I think the first question related to President Christofias, and I think something like the likelihood of him changing and adopting a different approach. The experience I've had as a Lobby for Cyprus member for over 20 years is that every time we talk to our leadership, we mention the concerns we've got, and can't we start afresh? And even after 2004, as you quite rightly said, we had the opportunity. They say, oh my God, don't be stupid. We lack all credibility in front of the UN and the Americans and the British. Don't be stupid. How could we possibly do that? How can we say we don't want Bizonal? They don't even know half the time, sometimes, what it exactly means. But so,
time 2 minutes.
Can we answer first that question there? What do we say to President Christofias? Who
is the Martin Luther King?
Yeah, that's the first question. Let me just go through the questions. The other questions really were cultural, I think, about Cyprus, rule of law and meritocracy. I think that was it, really. So really, is Cyprus ready for a change in the approach we're discussing? Because what we at Lobby want to do is not just talk about the issues, is talk about our plan. And Nick Gounoubia said, why can't we do that? And after 2004, we had the opportunity, because the Annan plan said, if it's not agreed by the Greek Cypriots, it's null and void. And the problem we have as Cypriots is we're not very good at marketing ourselves. No one ever knows really what we think. And that's something else we can talk about another time. But
I'll be very cynical, because you mentioned about meritocracy. Meritocracy begins at home. And so far we have the parties ruling and pulling the strings. We don't have meritocracy. You know that in Cyprus better than I do. So meritocracy should begin at home, doing the day-to-day chores, rather than whose connections you have that are going to give you a job in the public sector, which is another silly concept. Every graduate of the university seeks a public job thanks to some political connection or another. That's not merit.
Yes.
So merit begins at home before we start putting it at a much broader level, okay? And I'm Cypriot at heart, I'm not of Cypriot origin. I have worked for Cyprus, but that hurts me when I see that on a day-to-day basis. Cyprus, and to even a greater extent, Greece, where I'm working right now, suffers from a major leadership vacuum.
Yes.
And the sooner we realize the leadership vacuum existing in Nicosia and in Athens, we're going to be much better off starting to think about what that means for the future of both countries. Because the future of Cypriot Hellenism affects the future of Hellenism in general and Greece in particular. And I'll close with one comment. Christofias lately has been saying, Bizonal or partition. Come on. We have partition right now. And anybody who has read what the proposals for the Bizonal Bicommunal provide, they legalize, they formalize the partition. So we have to stop playing the rhetorical games and tell people what the reality of what they're confronted with. That's all. I'm cynical, I'm tired, I'm 75 years old, I've been too long around this issue, I'm not a Cypriot, I'm still going to fight against the Annan plan or its resurrection, but has to be a young generation to follow on this thing and stick to the principles of change, social and political change within the principles of the rule of law.
All I would add to that is, first of all, with Aligi's question, I'm reminded of Enoch Powell's observation that all political careers end in failure. President Christofias' judgment is not one that I would want to rely on with a view to settling the Cyprus question. He was promised by The Economist the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2008, and regrettably politicians have a tendency to go after short-term glory. Martin Luther King earned the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, but in 1973, do you know who earned the Nobel Peace Prize? Dr. Kissinger. The gentleman who's mentioned the churches, I was reminded by, talking about archbishops, have a look at the speeches given by the outgoing Archbishop of Canterbury on the fate of Christians in the Middle East. Even this month, a Coptic Orthodox community centre was burnt down. We could well be seeing over the next few years the influx of refugees from the Coptic Christian community from Egypt into Cyprus. We've already seen attacks on the Christians in Syria and elsewhere. This part of the world that the Republic inhabits is highly toxic, and religiously fueled violence is a part of the landscape. The last point I'd make is really concerning the Hillsborough disaster. Do you remember the Hillsborough disaster in the 89? I was at Arsenal on that day, Highbury, and my mother heard about the Hillsborough disaster and she thought I was at Hillsborough, whereas I was at Highbury. And at the time, everyone thought that the cause of the death of all of those football fans was their own activities. And the police created this tapestry of lies that the alleged hooligans were responsible and that they were clean. It took, 22 years for an official inquiry to uncover the truth, the cover-ups, the injustice that had been implemented on the dead people and their families. Their families campaigned for justice. It took them 22 years of relentless campaigning, and eventually the truth came out. The police were responsible for the Hillsborough disaster. It wasn't the victims, and it certainly wasn't the families who had been the victims of injustice. And the cardinal lesson of the Hillsborough inquiry is that if you have the truth, the law, and justice on your side, you must not give in, especially in the face of powerful people. You must stick to your principles, and eventually, even if you have to wait decades, as in the case of the Hillsborough families, justice will eventually prevail.
Just some concluding remarks. I think you'll all agree with me that we've been very fortunate tonight. We have two excellent speakers. They've dealt with the question head-on about analysis by communalism, and we at Lobby do deal with issues head-on, and we don't just deal in academia and talk about the issues. We want to talk about the way forward, and you have been given ideas about the way forward, which are pretty common sense to me, to be honest. And really what we have to battle with is our leadership on the island mostly, and we need to use these ideas, these debates, and show them there are fresh ideas, there are other approaches which have value, and the way we're going is really going into a dead end, when I look at it. So what I'd like you to do is, in the usual fashion, firstly to thank Professor Coufoudakis for coming all the way here from Cyprus. From Athens, and you know, I personally have learned a huge amount, and it's been entertaining as well as educational. Thank you to Dr Kyriakides for very inspirational as well. It's an interesting talk. Can I say, we at Lobby for Cyprus are volunteers. We're all volunteers. We spent hours on setting up seminars. Everyone at the back here has been here for hours. We need your support. Please put your name down if you can. Give us your email addresses. Buy some of the books. Tell your friends, your colleagues about us. Without support, without the community behind us, discussing the issues, and the one thing we don't do well, in my view, and it's going on for some of the questions here, we don't actually sell ourselves. In our position, we don't explain what's happening. We're too frightened, some of us, for some reason, particularly our leadership. And that's what we at Lobby for Cyprus have been doing for 20 years. Finally, most importantly, there are drinks. Please stay behind and join us and have a drink on us. And thank you again very much for attending tonight's Lobby for Cyprus seminar. Thank you.
Yeah.